Hello and welcome to this Sunrise webinar on requirements for CCAM safety assessment data framework content. My name is Julie Castermans from Ertico ITS Europe, and before I introduce our speakers and agenda for today, I would like to specify a few practical points. First of all, this webinar is being recorded, and the recording as well as the presentation slides will be shared afterwards on the project website. Second of all, we will take your questions at the end of our presentations in writing only, so please use the question pane in the GoToWebinar interface to raise your questions during the presentations. And finally, if you need to communicate anything with us organizers during the webinar, please use the chat pane in the interface. And now to the agenda and our speakers for today. So first, we will have a general overview of the Sunrise project and an introduction to the activity or working area in the project, looking after content harmonization of scenario data framework. This will be done by Sjef van Montfort, who is a senior consultant at TNO. Then Fadi Alakkad, who is a software architect and lead engineer at Warwick University, will present the first related results, that is the identified requirements for the data framework content definition. And now, without further ado, I'd like to give the floor to Sjef. So Sjef, the floor is yours for the first presentation.
Thank you very much, Julie, for the introduction. So let's see if the control change works. Yes, I think so. So as mentioned by Julie, I will first give a short introduction to the Sunrise project. So the Sunrise project is a European project that started in September 2022 and will run for 3 years, so till August 2025. It has a budget of around 13.5 million euros, where the goal is, to make it very short, is to develop a harmonized CCAM safety assurance framework. The reason for that is that we would like to address the different stakeholders that are related to ensuring that the automated vehicles that are being put on the road are safe. So there you can think of stakeholders like tool developers, because they need to ensure that the tools that they're making fit in, researchers, of course citizens, because they need to know that the vehicles that they are buying are safe, but also certifying bodies. How can certifying bodies ensure that the vehicles that are put on the road have a certain safety standard? But of course also the vehicle developers, because they need to know what to take into account. What's also good to take into account is that we look, of course, at Europe, but definitely we have a wider scope, because we believe that it's not just something that is relevant for Europe, but it's very important that we create a safety assurance framework that can be used all over the world, because in principle the concepts are the same everywhere, and it's very beneficial if we can use the same standards for them. And this is part of the Horizon Europe. Sunrise is part of Horizon Europe project. Yeah. So what's the work plan behind the Sunrise project? So in the center, we create this CCAM safety assurance framework. So there we want to have the different components that are relevant in such a safety assurance framework. If we then look more specifically to Sunrise, we have two columns that we focus on, because the overall safety assurance framework has so many components that we would like to focus. The focus within the Sunrise project is really on the method and tool chain, especially related to the scenario-based assessment, where the different types of testing are being combined. So there you can think of what about scenario selection and allocation, but also the rating, safety metrics, but also the relationship, how can you ensure that the virtual and the physical testing, they are both can be used. So the evaluation of the virtual versus the physical testing. On the other hand, an important component of the Sunrise project is related to the data framework. So there we look at things like the ontology to ensure that we're talking the same language among the different components. Again, like the quality metrics, but also the structure and the governance. There is a very important topics. We like to do that, of course, based on what's already there, but definitely also we realize that some of the components need to be further developed. We will have a few use cases that we use to demonstrate the safety assurance framework that is being created. If we then also look at what kind of results and demonstrators there will be. So on one hand, we will have the safety assessment framework and methods and tool chain, that is the descriptive part of that. There will be a safety assurance framework handbook created and being available. Probably that will be on an online version. There is a EU data framework and test case library where the first steps will be taken into a common available library that uses different scenario databases, because that's the concept of Sunrise. We will have the access to different scenario databases that are available and also are part of the partners that are in the Sunrise project. And via such a federated layer, we can access those databases to ensure that the scenarios that are needed can be extracted. And as I've already briefly mentioned, there's also a dedicated work practice that looks into use cases as demonstrators, so we can demonstrate the safety assurance concept or framework and the concepts that we have. Of course, as mentioned, this is not something that we do all by ourselves, so it's very important to engage and have the project results adopted by different stakeholders. There you have to think of type approval, so the type approval authorities in Europe, but also on a wider scale, the different member states, because they're also a very relevant stakeholder. Consumer testing is also something, because we would like to have a safety assurance framework that can also be used by the consumer testing, just for the sake of consistency. As already mentioned, ontology is a very important one, for example, and there it's very relevant to also look at harmonization and standardization. So the bodies that are relevant there, how to involve them and how can we use, because reinventing the wheel, we should do that. So there we really would like to use what's already there, or even also build upon that and to further develop harmonization and standardization. And of course, there is the international cooperation, where we really, as said, it's not just Europe, but we also are in close relationship to, for example, the US and Japan, to name a few, because we believe that it's very important that it's an international framework or safety assurance framework that will be developed. So then looking at the partners that are involved in Sunrise, there are about 22 partners. You can see that they are all spread over Europe. I think what's also very good to realize is that we have different types of partners in the consortium. Some are research related, some others are more industry related. For example, we have OEMs on board, but also tier 1s on board. We have some partners in that also have a large portion of their activities are related to testing, both virtual and physical testing. Research, there are some governmental partners in there to also represent that part of the pie. So we have a very wide range of partners to also ensure that the different stakeholders are being represented. So this is a picture of the General Assembly that was held during in September in Athens of this year, where we enjoyed the nice weather, but we had very constructive meetings to further develop the safety assurance framework and also to already discuss the different topics in more detail. So that's a bit about the overall description of the Sunrise project. Now talking a bit about getting more into detail about the topic of today. So I will also present a bit more about the work package that this is part of. So it's about the bigger work package is about the content harmonization of the scenario data framework I just mentioned. So the full title is the content harmonization of the scenario data framework, but to make it a simpler one, we call it ontology. The real purpose there of these activities that are in this work packages are related to describing and harmonize the properties and the features of the scenario databases that are being used. So as mentioned before, within Sunrise, the concept is that you have access to different scenario databases via a federated layer. But of course, in order to be able to do that, it's very important that the scenario databases have harmonized properties and features. This doesn't mean that they all need to have exactly the same, but at least you need to know how do they match and how do they compare. This is about the properties of the scenario database, but also about the scenario description that are used for the scenarios that are in this database. As mentioned, this is also to ensure the interoperability of the scenario databases. And also there, the concept is to do that because then we can maximize the completeness and the accessibility. So the concept is that the more scenario databases that there are available, the more data you have access to. And also perhaps some databases have certain countries or certain ODDs available where others don't have that. A relevant other topic related to this, so to the data framework, the scenario databases, is to develop some kind of quality metrics for the scenario databases, because you would like somehow to quantify the content of the scenario database in order also to be able to compare it, and perhaps you find out that you need to have more information, or for specific scenarios you miss certain information to know that. What's also very important is we need to ensure that what we develop and what we have is future proof. This means that it should be possible to scale it, but also definitely something that we need to consider is future scenarios. So we should be aware that there could be changes in the current layout of the road, or in the current objects, and in the scenario description that will change. So we need to have the flexibility to be able to facilitate that in the future. Just let me skip to the next page. So indeed, I already mentioned indeed the objectives and the goals of the work package that we're talking about. Just a short summary of what we so far already achieved there. So what we already did was the requirements listed on the data framework and the scenario database. That's actually something that will be discussed in the remainder of the project. For the other items, we already looked at the relevant ontologies and created an overview. Also, we clustered that to ensure that indeed we have alignment within the different scenario databases on the properties and the features, and use the same ontology. Besides that, we also, when looking at the quality metrics, we already had a look at what is currently there, and we're now working on to further elaborate on that and to further develop the quality metrics that are needed. Perhaps we need to define some new ones or extend current ones, and that's an ongoing process. All of this will also be reported later in the project. So to list the next steps besides the task that is being discussed today. So that's about the harmonization. I already briefly mentioned this indeed. So it's the completion of this literature review. It's more the reporting part. What is a very relevant one is that we will have an alignment on some of the formats, which are also being used in the other work packages within Sunrise. This includes format alignment on, for example, the ODD format, the test requirement format. Also a very important one is related to the scenario input and the outputs. And as mentioned already before, another very relevant one is the format alignment on the scenario definitions. The other one, what are the explicit tasks that will are related to the quality metrics? So as mentioned, it is the creating the list, but definitely also looking into new metrics that are needed to represent the information that is in the different scenario databases. So you can compare them, but you can also see where can they be beneficial and contribute to each other. This all is related to the other activities in Sunrise, but it's mainly in close cooperation with Work Package 6, which is related to the data framework design and usage definition. So in there, they much more look into the actual realization also of this federated layer and the realization of the interaction and the interfaces with the different scenario databases. So, sorry, I already moved too fast. I just need to go back. Yeah. So that's about the more general introduction of Sunrise, and in particular Work Package 6, to put a bit more context on where the activities that will Fadi present in the coming slides, how that is positioned, and how that fits in the bigger project. So I would like now to hand over to Fadi.
Thank you very much, Sjef, and thanks, Julie, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining this webinar. It's a pleasure being here discussing one of the essential aspects of the Sunrise project in collecting the requirements for the data framework and scenario database content. My name is Fadi, and I am the leader of the task 5.1, which is responsible about collecting the requirements. So first, before going into the deliverable objectives, I would like to explain a bit or highlight a bit of what we mean by the scenario data Sunrise data framework. So we see that the Sunrise data framework is representing a robust and an inclusive platform that can empower users with this seamless access to a wide range of the external scenario databases that are connected to this data framework. The main capability and the functionality would be around enabling the end users to search and then retrieve relevant scenarios from different scenario databases in a unique or federated layer or federated dashboard. In addition, the other functionality is more around validating the scenarios to ensure that the accuracy of the scenarios that the users are receiving. The other key of this Sunrise data framework is to simulate the integration with the testing execution components of the SAF, safety assurance framework. So overall, you can think about it that a way that can make it easy for users to search for scenarios and find specific ones that meet their specific requirements, and then feed that into their testing tool chain. So here we move on to the deliverable of 5.1. The main objective of the deliverable 5.1 is to give a detailed look at what the users and stakeholders that coming from different aspects, from industry, from academia, from engineering related field, to access the Sunrise data framework, and with the database, the external scenario databases that connected to this framework. So it describes the easy to use way to search scenarios, retrieving scenarios, formatting the scenarios, validating the retrieved scenarios, and then allow the users to bring these scenarios and test it on their testing tool chain, and maybe enable to the results to come back to the federated layer. The approach that we followed, or the methodology that we followed, is the same way I explained in the beginning, is to define the data framework. So because we need to understand what we are collecting the requirements for. So first we started to do brainstorming, understand the capability, the data framework requirements, and the functionalities needed, what can do, what cannot do. Then after that, we started to collect the requirements. And we were lucky that as Sjef mentioned in the partners slide, that the partners were included in 5.1 was from different aspects, from different regions, from different industries, and also from academia research side. So we brought together all these ideas and mindsets to produce the requirements for the data framework. The third step was resolving the requirements, and what we mean here is to omitting all the ambiguous requirements or the requirements that we feel that is not belonging to the data framework. And that stage was very critical, because there we were very we used the terminologies that should be used to the requirements. For example, the data framework should or should not, may not, shall not. So this is all be taken into consideration when we developed and resolve the requirements. Once we had that list of the requirements, then we started to group these requirements into clusters to make it easy to filter and search for specific requirements. Then we started to assign requirements to the clusters. This was based on the similarities or based on the relationship with the clusters. After that, we did several stages of reviewing of the requirements. So the first stage was internally, and the next stage was from external reviewers. It's worth mentioning that we have conducted 4 peer reviews to review the documents. Then the reviewers came up with their comments, and we applied the comments at the last step of this deliverable. Back to the content of the deliverable. So here you can think about the data framework as a federated layer that enable users to access the external scenario databases that connected to this data framework. And this access would be based on required authentication and authorization. Would be also this would be instructed by the data framework. The data framework and the scenario database will have their own authentication method. Then once the users are authenticated to access the framework, then they can retrieve scenarios from external scenario databases based on the search criteria. After that, once the scenarios being returned, the data framework will do some processing of the scenarios to harmonize the scenario data, make sure that these are the scenarios that the user are expected. And this process will involve multi-sub processes that I'll talk about in a bit. And also the way that other scenario databases that might be connected, or test results that also might be connected to the data framework in the backend side. The 4 main components of the data framework in 4 categories. First is the interfacing. So the interfacing, the requirements for the interfacing are in two sides. First is the GUI, which is how the users can interact with the data framework in a dashboard, in a graphical user interface, and then how they can search and interact with the external scenario database. And the other side is the API, and here more requirements on the API, how the API should be, the security of the API, the endpoints, and so on. So here we were trying to bring up all the stakeholders, from technical people, developers, engineers, or test engineers, or even non-technical people. So this is why we proposed having two methods to connect to data framework. The second one is the data processing. Here, they're more about grouping, tagging the scenarios, validating the scenarios, make sure that the scenarios coming in the accepted and the agreed format, and this format is valid, for example, like valid against its schema, and so on. Then the last one is the third one, sorry, the data retrieval, and here we are talking about the output that coming from the scenarios, from external scenario databases, the metadata tag, also that come up with the databases, like we're not talking about, for example, if this scenario has been created in different region, on different area, or different country. So this data that needs to be also come up with the scenarios that coming from the scenario databases. So we discussed the requirements, that what should be and what should not be existed. The last one is more on the management side and the governance side. You talk about the user management, the rules, what who can do what, and also we define more about the maintenance, the improvement, the versioning control, monitoring the data, monitoring the process and the logs that the users use to retrieve scenarios. Talk about the standards. We pay huge attention to the international standards while we were defining the requirements. Talk about the privacy concern and the finance. An example of the clusters, which is the first layer before the requirements. So here, an example of the clusters, like you have the user management that covering all the user operations in terms of user accounts, rules, who controlling the other users, and so on. The interfacing that I talked about, which represents the connection between the data framework and the external scenario databases, the UI and the GUI, and this also the requirements that how the visualization of the federated layer of the data framework should be, and this is widely discussed in work package 6 in designing the dashboard. Also the processing of the data, what we need to do with the data that's coming from different scenario databases, how we present that to the users, the versioning controls in terms of keeping, if the scenario has been changed, then we keep a version of that scenario with minor and major version that would be agreed later on. The file attachment, which we mean here that all the requirements that related with all the file type, like for example, if the users are not interested in the scenario, but they're more interested in the visualization of the scenarios that coming in an image or a video format. The structuring of the scenarios, which means when we get the scenario, how we organize these scenarios. The standards, we align we discussed the requirements that need to be aligned with the standards. And this is very, very important point, because sometimes different scenario databases have different formats, different definition to the scenarios. So we discussed how this should be aligned with ISO standards, ASAM standards, and etc. The filtering and the searching, which is when users can search for scenarios, how the users can search for the scenarios, how the external scenario databases can read this search criteria. More about the legal and the legal side, the privacy of the users also being taken into consideration, and we talked about the scenario definition, scenario content, the required parameter that should be achieved. So this is just an overview of the clustering. It's difficult to get all the requirements here, but I can't. I brought the requirements, some examples of the requirements and the clusters associated with this. But in the real deliverable, you will see more information like cluster ID, cluster definition, and same for the requirements ID, definition, and the description of the requirement. So here, just just 6 examples. First one, for example, here we are saying that the structure of the scenario description cluster and the requirement that belongs to that cluster is the result of the query with data framework should be reproducible, which means that when the users search for a use case with long use case, and this result of that should be maintained. So when the users or other users search for the same criteria, we can easily bring back these results. In terms of filtering, here we are saying that in the requirements that different scenario databases can understand the same language when we use the query process. For example, if I'm searching about crossroad cutting with pedestrian, in the search criteria, all the scenarios, external scenario databases should understand this and use only one query to fetch the scenarios. In the metadata, here we're talking the requirements talking about what the information should come as a metadata, and this will be on agreed taxonomy, and this is one of the tasks that being discussed, I think 5.2 and 5.3. The other 2 requirements in the scenario definition and format. So we are saying that the requirement that the scenario that should return to the user shall contain a human readable description, which means that the users might interact with the federated layer, might not be very technical, or they cannot understand the if the scenarios come up with open drive, maybe they cannot understand that. So we are talking here about the description of the scenario should be able to be read by human. And also here we align that this needs to be also aligned with ISO standards. The other one is that the scenarios should have elements such as dynamic objects, the weather information, and road layout and stuff. The legal part is one of the requirements. We talk about the privacy and the respect of the usage of the personal information aligned to GDPR, and all privacy topics. So this is just an example of the requirements that we came up at the end of this deliverable. In the conclusion, this was a fundamental work that will be used in different work packages, and also I'm involved in work package 6 of the Sunrise, and I can see that how this is helpful for users when they are developing their input or their output or their the concept of the other work packages. We ended up with 17 clusters and 74 unique requirements. And this is everything from my side. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Fadi. I don't think we have any question from the audience already right now. So from my side, I was thinking maybe to ask you, how do you propose to deal with the conflicting standards? I don't know if one of you has a view on that.
That's interesting topic. This is also was one of the issues of that we had in when we developed the requirements, because like if you are not talking about international standard, let's talk about now other topic is when every scenario, external scenario database has its own, sometimes has its own way to define and describe scenarios. So if you want to interact with this scenario database individually, you need to align with their structure. So I think the solution for this is the one that we proposed is to align with international standards. For example, ASAM, Open Scenario, Open Drive, or we can use the ISO standard 34503 for defining the ODD and the taxonomy of the scenarios. But yeah, this issue is still difficult, because even for the other scenario databases that I talked about in the beginning, that they have their own description, they need to have, if they need to align with this international standard, so they need to have a conversion from their end to convert their existing format to this international standard, and this is one also of the issues.
Thank you. Sjef, do you want to add something, or Fadi has made it all clear? While I'm inviting the other attendees, of course, to raise other questions in the meantime. We're expecting your questions.
Yeah, to add to that, we also discussed it, I think, earlier on, is we sometimes also face challenges where there are standards, but around the world, the standards are not fully aligned. And then the question is indeed if it's about scenario description, or if it's about ODD description, or any other. It can be sometimes really a challenge, because yes, we find standards for that, but they are conflicting, or at least not exactly the same, or not exactly matching. And then it can be really a challenge. And in the end, I think you need to make a decision. Because introducing a third one that is kind of in between standards is also not very beneficial. So that can sometimes be a big challenge. I think on the other hand, what is important is at least to be aware of the different standards, and to also be aware of what the content is and in what way they conflict. Because sometimes it's about a definition where in theory you could argue that they conflict, but in the practical sense they sometimes don't conflict. So it's important to really find out and to get into detail of the standards to really see, is there a real conflict, and then trying to select the best one.
Okay, clear. So still no questions from the audience. So maybe another one from my side. How could a topic like requirement listing process be made future-proof in your view? I don't know which one.
Yeah, thanks. I think it's a very relevant question, because I think we run into it in European projects, but in many projects. So the moment you start creating a list of requirements, time goes on and you get new insights, but it is a very relevant activity, because based on these requirements, you start developing, in our case, a safety assurance framework, or even the scenario-based access, but in a sense also you put requirements to the scenario databases. So it is very important to have, in a way, a fixed list of requirements, but you also need to have the flexibility to be able to adjust it, and to have a good process where you can record it, and if changes are made, to do that. And there it's sometimes a problem, also considering that, like, this EU project is a project with limited duration. How can you ensure that indeed what was done stays flexible and can be used in the future, but also adopted if needs to be changed?
Thank you.
You have something to add there, Fadi?
Yeah, indeed.
Yeah, I just would like to add to this that, yeah, there's maybe more processes regarding reviewing the requirements every now and then, because the requirements are subject to change, if not the content of the requirements, but so one example, like we mentioned that it needs to be aligned with the standards, and the standard itself might be changed or might be upgraded, which might make the requirements is not valid anymore, because this requirements was set based on this version of this standard. So the solution of this is reviewing the requirement maybe like every now and then, as I mentioned, but on a fixed time, or maybe we can add maybe versioning to the requirement, so to keep tracking of the requirements and if anything changed.
Yeah, and to make a small comment indeed there, which I think what's also important is to sometimes not to stick too much to the requirements, because they change over time. You need to realize that it could be that the requirement you once set is not applicable anymore, and so sometimes you need to be a bit careful with that.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, thank you both. Still no questions from the audience, so you were crystal clear. I want to invite people who actually want to know more about what you presented to have a look at the report itself. You can see the link where to find it, or see here the QR code to get to it directly. And if really no further questions, last chance to raise it. I would like to inform you that our next webinar will be held already later on this month, on the 28th, on CCAM use cases validation requirements. We will issue the registration link very soon, so stay tuned and follow our channels to find out about this, and join us on this occasion as well. And since there are no further questions, then I think we can close this webinar. I would like to thank our two speakers for their presentations, and thank the audience as well for taking the time to be here with us this afternoon. Thanks a lot, and see you next time.
Thank you all.
Thank you very much.